Imagine a very quiet night, the kind of night where even the wind feels sleepy. In this calm darkness, ancient China rests, not restless, not afraid, just calm, confident, and deeply sure of itself. At this moment in history, China is not worried about tomorrow. It does not feel rushed. It does not feel threatened. It feels complete, like a person who has eaten a good meal, locked the doors, and is already half asleep before their head touches the pillow. This is China at its peak. Cities glow softly under moonlight. Lanterns hang still, barely moving. Streets are quiet, but not empty. Somewhere, a guard walks slowly, not because he fears danger, but because routine must be respected. In homes, families sleep peacefully, trusting that the empire above them is strong, stable, and permanent. China believes it has figured life out. For centuries, this empire has survived storms that destroyed others. It has endured invasions, rebellions, floods, and famines. Dynasties have risen and fallen, but the idea of China has remained solid, like a mountain that simply watches time pass by. By now, China does not see itself as just another country. It sees itself as the center of the world. And honestly, from its own point of view, that belief makes sense. The empire is vast. Huge rivers flow like veins across the land. Farms stretch far into the distance. Markets are busy during the day, orderly and predictable. Officials write reports with neat brush strokes. Laws exist. Traditions are followed. Everything has its place. Even chaos, when it appears, is handled politely. China's rulers believe in balance. Balance between heaven and earth. Balance between ruler and people. Balance between tradition and change. But mostly, they believe in tradition. The empire runs on systems built long ago. Exams decide who becomes an official. Respect decides who speaks first. Elders are honored. History is remembered. Change is slow, careful, and usually unwelcome. And because of this, the empire feels timeless. Outside the palace walls, farmers wake before sunrise. They work the land the same way their ancestors did. Inside the palace, scholars debate poetry, philosophy, and governance. They quote texts written hundreds of years earlier, as if the past is still alive and sitting in the room with them. This is not an empire that rushes. This is an empire that waits. China does not feel the need to chase the future. It assumes the future will come to it. In the emperor's court, officials speak softly and confidently. They believe their system is superior. Foreign lands are seen as distant, strange, and mostly irrelevant. If outsiders want something from China, they must come politely, bow deeply, and accept China's rules. Because why wouldn't they? China has silk so smooth it feels unreal, tea so refined it becomes a daily ritual, porcelain so perfect it looks fragile, even when it is strong. What could the outside world possibly offer in return? From China's perspective, other nations are like noisy neighbors. Interesting, sometimes annoying, but not truly important. They trade, they fight, they expand, but China remains China, calm, ancient, unmoved. At night, the empire sleeps with confidence. It does not sleep with one eye open. It does not check the doors twice. It does not worry about hidden dangers. It sleeps like a giant who has never been hurt before. And giants, when they sleep deeply, do not notice small things. They do not notice quiet changes. They do not notice slow shifts. They do not notice something slipping gently into the room. At this stage, opium is not a word that troubles the empire. It exists, yes, but only at the edges. It is distant, minor, unimportant. Nothing that deserves serious attention. China has laws. China has order. China has discipline. Surely, something small and foreign cannot disturb something this old and powerful. The empire trusts itself completely. This confidence shows in daily life. Taxes are collected, soldiers train, though not urgently. Weapons are polished more for ceremony than war. The military exists, but it does not feel pressure. It has no reason to. When an empire believes it is unbeatable, it slowly stops preparing to be challenged. And why should it prepare? China has defeated enemies before. It has absorbed cultures, rewritten borders, and reshaped society again and again. Each time, it survived. Each time, it returned to balance. So now, balance feels permanent. The emperor is seen as the son of heaven. His rule is not just political, it is cosmic. If he rules well, the universe itself is in harmony. Floods, droughts, and disasters are signs of imbalance, not failure. And right now, things feel balanced enough. There is no panic in the court, no urgency in the streets, no fear in the countryside, only routine, only habit, only sleep. This is important to understand. Empires do not usually fall when they are afraid. They fall when they are comfortable. They fall when danger does not look dangerous, when threats arrive quietly, wearing friendly faces. At this moment, China does not see itself as fragile. It sees itself as eternal. The walls feel high enough. The traditions feel strong enough. The past feels wise enough. And in this peaceful confidence, the empire rests, breathing slowly, dreaming softly, certain that tomorrow will look just like today. This calm is beautiful. It is also dangerous, because history has a strange habit. It does not knock loudly. It does not shout warnings. It often enters quietly, sits down, and waits. And while China sleeps peacefully under the moonlight, something small, slow, and seemingly harmless is already part of the world around it. Not loud enough to wake the empire, not strong enough to scare it, not serious enough to be stopped, at least not yet. For now, the empire sleeps, and the night remains calm. When China was strong, it was very strong, not loud strong, not dramatic strong, more like calm, quiet. We've been doing this forever, strong. This was an empire that did not need to prove itself. It already believed it had won history. At its height, China felt complete. The borders were wide, the population was massive, the land was productive, rivers carried goods, boats and ideas across long distances. Roads connected cities like veins connecting a living body. Everything moved, but nothing rushed. The government was organized in a way that felt almost boring. And boring, for an empire, is actually a good thing. Officials were selected through long exams, not family names, not luck exams, years of studying classics, philosophy, and proper behavior. If you passed, you earned respect. If you failed, you studied more. This system made China proud. It believed intelligence and discipline were more important than bloodlines. And in many ways, it was right. The empire ran on paperwork, seals, reports, and careful planning. Decisions were written down, reviewed, and stored. Nothing was meant to be impulsive. Even power wore polite clothing. The emperor sat at the top, but he was surrounded by advisors, scholars, and administrators. He was powerful, yes, but also expected to rule responsibly. His job was not just to command, but to maintain harmony. Harmony was everything. From the capital city, orders flowed outward like gentle waves. Provinces followed rules. Governors reported back. Taxes were collected, counted, and redistributed. Grain was stored for bad years. Infrastructure was repaired. Bridges, canals, and walls were maintained like household chores. It was not exciting. It was effective. China's economy was one of the most advanced in the world. Markets were busy but controlled. Prices were known. Merchants understood the rules. Farmers produced enough to feed millions. Trade networks moved silk, tea, rice, salt, and ceramics across the empire. Money existed, contracts existed, trust existed, and when trust exists, people sleep better. Chinese cities were impressive, not because they were flashy, but because they worked. Streets were organized, neighborhoods had purpose, shops knew their place. Temples stood quietly, reminding people that life was more than profit. Education was respected. Scholars were admired. A person who could write well and think deeply held social power. This created a culture where ideas mattered, but tradition mattered more. Innovation happened, but slowly. China had already invented many things the world admired: paper, printing, gunpowder, compasses. These were not new toys anymore. They were old achievements, folded neatly into daily life. That is what success looks like after a long time. Achievements stop feeling magical. They start feeling normal. The military, too, reflected this mindset. China had soldiers, forts, and defenses. But the army did not feel desperate. It was there to maintain order, not to conquer the world. The empire preferred stability over expansion. Walls were built. Borders were guarded. But aggression was not the main personality. Why risk change when things already work? Foreign visitors often felt this confidence immediately. They were impressed, but also slightly uncomfortable. China did not rush to impress them. It did not beg for trade. It did not chase alliances. It expected respect. In the Chinese worldview, the emperor ruled under heaven, and other nations existed somewhere below that order. Foreign traders were tolerated, not embraced. They were allowed to trade under strict rules, at specific ports, at specific times. China did not see itself as part of a global competition. It saw itself as the standard. This belief shaped everything. When officials discussed foreign lands, they did so with mild curiosity, not concern. Europe was far away. Its politics were messy. Its wars were frequent. Its leaders changed too often. China looked at that and quietly shook its head. Why live like that? Inside the empire, life followed rhythm. Seasons guided agriculture, festivals guided joy, ancestors guided morality. People knew where they stood and most accepted it. This acceptance created peace, but it also created stillness. At its height, China did not feel pressure to evolve. Its system had worked for generations. It assumed it would keep working. This assumption was powerful. It made rulers confident. It made officials relaxed. It made society comfortable. Comfort is pleasant. It is also sneaky, because when comfort lasts too long, curiosity fades, urgency disappears. Problems seem smaller than they really are. Even warnings, when they appear, feel distant. China's greatest strength was its stability. Its greatest weakness was the belief that stability meant safety. From the outside, the empire looked unshakable. From the inside, it felt eternal. People planned their lives assuming the system would always be there. And why wouldn't they? The dynasty had survived before. It had weathered storms. It had restored order again and again. History, in China, was a circle, not a straight line. Collapse was followed by renewal, so even decline, if it ever came, was not feared. This belief softened the edges of danger. At its peak, China did not worry about corruption too much. It existed, yes, but it was manageable. Officials could be replaced. Laws could be enforced. Problems were seen as temporary disruptions, not structural flaws. The empire trusted its own weight. It believed that something so large, so old, so refined could not be pushed easily. Small forces bounced off it. Foreign pressure felt like noise at the gate. And because of this, China did not listen closely. This is the quiet irony of greatness. When an empire is young, it listens. When it is threatened, it adapts. When it is great for too long, it relaxes. China at its height was relaxed. It was wise, organized, wealthy, and calm. It had every reason to be proud. It had no reason, it believed, to be afraid. And so life continued. Officials wrote reports. Farmers planted crops. Merchants sold goods. Scholars debated texts. The emperor ruled with ceremony and confidence. Everything looked strong. Everything felt stable. Everything seemed under control. This was China's greatest moment. And like many great moments in history, it did not realize it was standing at the edge of change. It simply enjoyed the calm. While China rested in its calm confidence, the world outside its borders was not resting at all. It was noisy. It was impatient. And it was always moving. Beyond China's mountains, deserts, and seas, other empires lived very differently. They did not trust long peace. They did not expect balance to last forever. They planned, worried, fought, and expanded like people who believed tomorrow might not be kind. If China was a wise elder sitting quietly, the rest of the world was a group of restless youngsters pacing the room. In Europe, kingdoms rose and fell quickly. Borders changed often. Wars came and went like bad weather. Leaders did not rule for centuries. Some barely ruled for years. Power shifted fast, and nobody felt safe enough to relax. This constant tension created a certain habit. European states learned to compete. They competed for land. They competed for wealth. They competed for influence. And most importantly, they competed for trade. Ships crossed oceans. Explorers searched for routes. Merchants looked for goods that could be sold for profit back home. Silver, spices, sugar, and textiles moved across seas in large quantities. Trade was not just business, it was survival. Countries that failed to trade fell behind. Countries that fell behind became weak, so Europe stayed busy. Meanwhile, in South Asia, large populations worked under colonial pressure. Resources were extracted. Crops were grown not always for locals, but for distant markets. Empires controlled ports, roads, and trade routes with military force. The world was becoming connected, but not peacefully. It was a connection built on pressure. As ships improved and navigation became more reliable, oceans stopped feeling like walls. They became highways. Nations that mastered the sea gained power far beyond their borders, and many of them looked east. They heard stories about China, stories about silk that felt unreal, tea that calmed the mind, porcelain that did not break easily, a market so large it could absorb endless goods. To European traders, China felt like a dream destination. There was just one problem. China did not need them. From the Chinese point of view, foreign lands were interesting but unnecessary. China produced what it needed. Its people worked. Its systems functioned. Trade existed, but only on China's terms. Foreign merchants were allowed to trade at limited ports. They followed strict rules. They paid fees. They accepted schedules. They bowed both literally and politically. This arrangement made sense to China. It did not make sense to Europe. European traders wanted access. More ports, more freedom, more profit. They wanted balance in trade, meaning they wanted China to buy as much as it sold. But China did not want European goods. China did not want their wool. It did not want their tools. It did not want their ideas. China wanted silver, and lots of it. So European traders paid silver, tons of it. Ship after ship carried precious metal eastward. Slowly, painfully, Europe watched its silver leave. This created frustration. Back home, governments noticed the imbalance. Money was flowing out, goods were flowing in. This was not sustainable. Something had to change, and when pressure builds, creativity follows. Outside China, the world was experimenting new weapons, new ships, new financial systems, new ways to force trade when polite requests failed. Colonial empires were not patient. They did not wait for permission forever. They had learned something important. If trade did not open naturally, it could be pushed open. This mindset was very different from China's. China believed respect created order. Europe believed power created opportunity. While China trusted history, Europe trusted momentum. The distance between these two worldviews was large, but they were slowly moving closer. In Southeast Asia, trading ports became busy crossroads. Cultures mixed. Merchants bargained loudly. Goods changed hands quickly. Control over these ports meant control over wealth. Everyone wanted a piece of the global flow, except China, which believed the flow would come to it naturally. This difference mattered, because while China stayed still, the world learned to move faster. Outside China's borders, competition sharpened minds. Nations invested in naval power, cannons improved, ships grew larger and more dangerous, armies became more organized, war became efficient, and efficiency, once learned, does not disappear. China saw some of this from a distance. Reports arrived, stories were told, but the empire did not feel personally threatened. These conflicts felt far away, like storms on another horizon. The Great Wall still stood, the borders still held, the systems still worked. So why worry? This confidence created a gap. On one side of the gap was a calm empire rooted in tradition. On the other side was a restless world driven by competition. Neither side fully understood the other. China assumed foreigners would eventually accept its rules. Foreign powers assumed China would eventually bend. Both were wrong in different ways. Outside China, merchants were not just traders. They were scouts. They gathered information. They studied markets. They looked for weaknesses. They noticed habits, restrictions, and patterns. They noticed that China's strength came from stability. They also noticed that stability depended on control, and control, if disrupted quietly, could weaken even a strong system. These ideas did not form overnight. They grew slowly, through frustration and observation. The world beyond China was learning lessons China did not feel the need to learn. Lessons about speed, lessons about pressure, lessons about exploiting demand. And while China continued to believe it stood above global chaos, the chaos slowly reorganized itself. By the time Chinese officials looked outward more seriously, the world had already changed. Ships were faster, weapons were stronger, trade networks were tighter. The global game had new rules, but China was still playing by old ones. This did not make China foolish, it made China consistent. Consistency had protected it for centuries. But consistency without adjustment can become rigidity. The outside world did not see China as evil or weak. It saw China as an opportunity, a vast, wealthy, controlled market that had not yet been fully opened. And markets that resist opening often attract force. At night, beyond China's borders, ships sailed under foreign flags. Deals were made in dim ports. Governments planned quietly. Merchants calculated profits. The world did not sleep as deeply as China did. It stayed awake. It stayed alert. It stayed hungry. And while China trusted its walls, traditions, and past victories, the rest of the world prepared in its own way. Not with loud threats, not with sudden attacks, but with patience, planning, and persistence. The borders of China still looked solid, but beyond them, the world was changing shape. Slowly, relentlessly, and with purpose. Picture ancient China, busy markets full of colors, smells, and people. Silk rolls stacked high, spices filling the air, and the smell of tea everywhere. Now imagine Western travelers, dusty from long journeys, walking into these markets and just going, "Wow." That's how trade between China and the West started, slow, exciting, and full of curiosity. China was proud and advanced. Sometimes it felt like, "We don't really need you, but you're interesting." Yet human curiosity and the love for shiny, new things kept trade alive. The most famous route was the Silk Road. It wasn't just one road. It was a network stretching from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Camel caravans carried silk, spices, tea, and sometimes even stories. Along the way, ideas, culture, and even rumors traveled just like the goods. Silk was China's superstar export. Roman nobles and wealthy people were obsessed with it. Some even wore silk secretly to show off their status. The West didn't just want silk, they wanted tea, porcelain, and sometimes coins with unique Chinese designs. China, in return, wanted Western horses, glassware, and gold or silver. One funny thing about early trade was communication. With translators, hand gestures, and lots of dramatic expressions, misunderstandings were normal. How much silk? Wait, yes or no? Let's drink tea first. Somehow, deals still happened. During the Qing Dynasty, trade really boomed. The capital city, Chang'an, was crowded, chaotic, and full of life, like a buzzing hive. Merchants from Persia, India, and Arabia came to trade spices, glass, carpets, and more, while taking Chinese silk, paper, and porcelain back to their homelands. The West didn't always travel directly. Middlemen, Persian, Arab, and Central Asian merchants handled the routes, languages, and deserts. They were basically the ancient version of FedEx, but with camels and donkeys instead of trucks. Porcelain changed the game. Before Chinese porcelain, pottery was fragile, dull, or boring. Chinese porcelain was shiny, delicate, and could survive long journeys. Europeans were so impressed they started calling it China. And then there was tea. Westerners were confused at first. You just steep leaves in hot water. But soon, tea became a huge craze, and the trade grew massive. Trade wasn't always safe. Bandits, storms, and political conflicts made journeys dangerous. Imagine traveling for months only to lose everything in a sandstorm or a pirate attack. Yet merchants kept going because the reward, money, prestige, and exotic goods was too big to ignore. Trade also spread ideas and technology. Papermaking, printing, and gunpowder traveled west. Astronomy, medicine, and other knowledge went east. So early trade wasn't just about goods, it was a massive knowledge exchange. By the Song Dynasty, maritime trade grew even bigger. Ports in southern China, like Guangzhou, became busy hubs. Ships loaded with porcelain, silk, and tea sailed across the South China Sea to Southeast Asia, India, and beyond. Sea travel was risky but faster and more adventurous than dusty land routes. The big takeaway: humans have always been curious, stubborn, and a little greedy. Trade connected civilizations, spread culture, and shaped history. So imagine a calm night in Chang, lanterns flickering, the scent of spices in the air, and merchants dreaming about faraway lands. This was early trade, slow, vibrant, and full of life. By the 18th century, China was one of the richest and most powerful countries in the world. Its cities were bustling. The markets were overflowing with silk, tea, and porcelain, and the empire was mostly self-sufficient. From the outside, it looked like China didn't need anything from the West. But, as history often shows, human curiosity and greed always find a way. Western traders, especially the British, were eager to get their hands on Chinese goods. Tea was the biggest obsession. Europeans drank it like water, and it had become central to their culture. But there was a problem. China didn't want much from Europe in return. Silk, porcelain, and tea were in high demand, but the Chinese mostly accepted silver. Europe didn't have enough silver to cover its imports, which created a serious trade imbalance. The solution: enter opium, a powerful narcotic that would change everything. The British East India Company, which controlled British trade in Asia, saw opium as the perfect answer. They grew it in India, processed it into a highly addictive form, and started selling it to Chinese traders. Suddenly, a way to balance the trade deficit appeared. China would take opium, and the West would get tea, silk, and porcelain. At first, opium trade was limited and somewhat secretive. Smugglers and merchants found creative ways to get the drug into China without attracting the attention of the authorities. It wasn't long before opium began spreading through major port cities like Canton, and its popularity started growing among Chinese merchants and officials. The Qing Dynasty, which ruled China at the time, quickly realized the dangers. They had long banned opium, seeing it as harmful to society. But enforcement was difficult. Smugglers were clever, corruption was widespread, and the profits were enormous. For many traders, the risk was worth it. Opium didn't just move in small quantities. It became a massive trade network connecting India, China, and Europe. British merchants supplied India grown opium, Chinese middlemen distributed it inland, and European powers collected the profits. Ports and coastal towns started buzzing with opium activity. Ships carried it alongside tea, silk, and other goods, making the trade more profitable than any other commodity at the time. The effects on Chinese society were dramatic. Addiction began spreading quietly at first, but then became widespread. People from all walks of life, merchants, farmers, and even government officials fell into the habit. Families struggled, productivity dropped, and the social fabric started to fray. The Qing government was alarmed. They tried banning the drug more aggressively, seizing shipments and punishing traders. But it was like plugging holes in a sinking ship. Despite the growing problems, Western traders pushed harder. The profits were too big to ignore, and their governments often supported them indirectly. The opium trade became more than just a business. It became a symbol of power, greed, and the clash between cultures. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, opium was no longer just a hidden commodity. It was a full-scale trade affecting the economy, politics, and society. Chinese ports were flooded with the drug, and smuggling networks had expanded inland. Families were ruined, officials were bribed, and the Qing Dynasty faced one of its biggest internal crises in centuries, all because of a single addictive plant grown thousands of miles away. What makes the birth of the opium trade so significant is how it set the stage for the future. It wasn't just about drugs. It was about global trade, imbalance of power, and exploitation. It marked the beginning of a period where foreign powers could manipulate China economically and politically, using trade as a weapon. At its core, the opium trade was a mix of greed, desperation, and opportunity. Western traders needed a way to balance the books. China tried to resist, and millions of lives were affected in the process. So, when we look back, the birth of the opium trade wasn't just a story about drugs. It was a story about how global trade can shape empires, societies, and history itself. And in the next few decades, the consequences would become impossible to ignore, changing the course of China forever. At first, opium was a small, almost invisible part of Chinese life. It wasn't a sudden explosion of addiction or chaos. It crept in slowly, quietly, like smoke slipping under a door. Only a few traders and wealthy individuals experimented with it, and many saw it as a curiosity from the West rather than a serious threat. Opium first appeared in port cities, especially Canton. Merchants who had contact with European traders discovered the drug and began using it recreationally. At that time, opium wasn't smoked in the way most people think of today. Some people ingested it orally in small doses or mixed it with other substances. It was a luxury item, expensive and exotic, and at first, only the rich could afford it. The Qing government had already banned opium, seeing it as dangerous. But enforcement was tricky. Ports were crowded, corruption was widespread, and smugglers were clever. Officials often turned a blind eye, especially if they were bribed. Opium quietly spread through Chinese society without anyone fully realizing how serious it would become. One of the key reasons opium spread was its addictive nature. People didn't start out addicted. They tried it for relaxation, for pleasure, or simply because it was fashionable in some circles. Slowly, dependence grew. Some merchants, officials, and even peasants who had access through friends or family began to use it more regularly. Social habits started changing, almost imperceptibly. Opium dens began appearing in cities. These were small, private spaces where people could smoke in secret. At first they were exclusive only for the elite or curious foreigners. But over time, even the middle class found ways to participate. Smoking opium became part of social gatherings, business meetings, and entertainment. It started blending into the daily rhythm of life, quietly influencing culture and behavior. Families began to feel the first effects. A father who once worked all day might start spending hours in an opium den. Young men curious about Western habits might experiment and fall into dependence. Productivity dropped slowly, and money that could have gone to households or trade often went to opium instead. Yet, because the spread was gradual, many families didn't notice the damage until it was significant. The Qing government tried multiple times to control it. Officials seized shipments, punished smugglers, and even executed repeat offenders. But the trade was profitable. The demand kept growing, and smugglers found creative ways around restrictions. Corruption and bribery made the problem worse. Opium didn't just cross borders, it crossed social classes, moving from wealthy elites to merchants, and then further down the economic ladder. By the early 19th century, opium had quietly become a serious social issue. Addiction wasn't obvious at first, but the patterns were forming. Society began to feel the strain, families destabilized, officials compromised, and cities faced new social challenges. The drug didn't burst into the culture dramatically. It seeped in like water through cracks, slowly altering habits, priorities, and even the economy. What makes this period striking is how normal life continued even as opium took root. Markets, schools, and government offices still functioned. Yet beneath the surface, the drug was slowly changing the social fabric of China. By the time most people realized the scale of the problem, the opium habit had become widespread enough to affect entire communities. In essence, opium quietly entered Chinese society not with a bang, but with a whisper. It started as an exotic curiosity, became a social habit, and eventually turned into a hidden crisis. The Qing Dynasty faced a challenge that was invisible at first, yet would soon demand drastic action. Opium's silent entry into Chinese life shows how slowly social problems can grow when they are addictive, profitable, and hard to control. By understanding this early stage, we can see the roots of a crisis that would eventually shake the empire and change the course of Chinese history forever. By the early 19th century, opium had quietly but steadily spread through Chinese society. Families were struggling, officials were secretly addicted, and the economy was starting to feel the strain. Yet the Qing Empire, one of the most powerful and sophisticated empires in the world, mostly ignored the warning signs. The government knew opium was dangerous. Reports came in from local officials and even concerned merchants about addiction, social decline, and rising corruption. But the rulers often underestimated the problem. Many believed it was limited to a small group of people in port cities or that it would go away on its own. Others were simply too focused on politics, rebellions, and maintaining control over the vast empire to deal with this foreign curiosity. Meanwhile, smugglers and Western traders continued to profit. Smuggling networks were clever and widespread, using hidden compartments in ships, secret routes through rivers and mountains, and bribery to evade authorities. The opium trade was too lucrative to stop without risking foreign retaliation, and the empire hesitated. At the same time, some officials were corrupt or indifferent. Bribes flowed, shipments were allowed, and the punishment for breaking opium laws was inconsistent. This gave smugglers a sense of impunity, and the problem quietly grew worse. Even as addiction increased among the population, many leaders treated it as a minor issue, believing that morality campaigns or small fines could control it. Society itself was beginning to show cracks. Families struggled with addicted members, productivity in some sectors declined, and local officials faced pressure to enforce laws they could barely control. Yet the empire continued business as usual, focusing on bigger threats like rebellions or border conflicts. Opium, slowly poisoning the population, wasn't seen as urgent. This period shows a crucial human and political mistake, ignoring early warning signs. The Qing rulers had information reports and even first-hand observations of the problem, but action was delayed. Partly it was pride, believing China could resist foreign influence, and partly it was fear of economic and diplomatic consequences if the West retaliated. By the time some leaders realized how serious the situation had become, opium addiction had spread into multiple social classes, and the networks of smugglers were well established. The empire had effectively let the problem grow unchecked, setting the stage for the crisis that would follow. Ignoring the warning signs wasn't just a passive choice, it had consequences. Corruption deepened, addiction spread, and the social and economic fabric of China was weakened. The empire had knowledge of the threat, but delayed decisive action, allowing foreign traders to expand their influence and gain power inside China without even using armies. In the end, this period shows how dangerous it can be to underestimate a slowly growing problem. The Qing Empire was strong, organized, and proud, but its hesitation and overconfidence in the face of a creeping threat allowed opium to gain a foothold that would eventually challenge the empire itself. By the early 19th century, opium was no longer a secret luxury. It had started quietly, but now it was spreading fast through Chinese society. What began as a small habit among traders and wealthy elites was now reaching merchants, farmers, and even some officials. The empire was waking up to a problem that had been growing under its nose. Opium's addictive nature was the main reason for this spread. People didn't notice at first. They tried it for fun, relaxation, or socializing. But over time, dependence grew. A single habit could easily turn into daily use, and soon families, communities, and workplaces felt the effects. Productivity dropped as addicted workers and officials spent more time chasing the drug than doing their jobs. Small opium dens started appearing in cities. Initially, these were secretive, discreet places for the elite, but as demand grew, dens spread to middle-class neighborhoods. Smoking opium became a social activity for many. Business deals were sometimes made in opium dens, and meetings often involved the drug. Its use was becoming normalized, and more people were falling into the cycle without fully realizing it. The Qing government tried to respond. Officials seized shipments, punished smugglers, and warned the population about addiction. But enforcement was difficult. Smugglers were clever, ports were busy, and bribery made laws almost meaningless. The profits for traders were enormous, so they found ways to evade the rules. Meanwhile, addicts often hid their habit, making it even harder for authorities to control the problem. Rural areas were also affected. Farmers and laborers, who initially had little contact with Western trade, began encountering opium through local networks. Families started to struggle as income that should have gone to food, education, or household needs was spent on the drug instead. Slowly, the social fabric of towns and villages began to fray. By this point, addiction was no longer a private issue. Communities began to see patterns: absentee fathers, declining productivity, corruption, and social tension. The problem was spreading from the cities to the countryside, and it was beginning to touch every level of society. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is that addiction was invisible at first. There was no sudden crisis, there were no huge headlines. Instead, it spread quietly, affecting individuals and families one at a time, until it became a widespread social and economic issue. The Qing Empire was aware, but responses were slow and inconsistent. Some leaders recognized the growing problem, but they were hesitant to take strong action against foreign traders or risk political instability. The result? Opium continued to flow, and addiction spread further, creating a problem that would eventually challenge the empire on a massive scale. By the end of this stage, opium had become much more than a luxury or curiosity. It was a social habit, an economic drain, and a growing threat to public health. Addiction had started to weave itself into the fabric of daily life, and the empire was still struggling to respond effectively. This chapter shows how a small, seemingly manageable problem can grow quietly into a full-scale crisis when addictive substances, profit, and weak enforcement combine. Addiction was no longer hidden, it was spreading, and China was about to face the consequences. As opium use spread across China, another problem grew alongside it: corruption. The Qing government had laws banning opium, but enforcing them was much harder than anyone expected. Bribes, favoritism, and fear of foreign retaliation made the system weak, and the very people responsible for enforcing the rules were often part of the problem. Officials who were supposed to stop the trade sometimes accepted bribes from smugglers. Ships carrying opium could pass through ports safely if the right coins changed hands. In some cases, local authorities even turned a blind eye to addicts among the elite, because punishing them would have caused social or political complications. Slowly, corruption became normal. This corruption didn't just help smugglers, it also spread into other areas of governance. Resources meant for public projects were sometimes diverted, and enforcement of other laws became inconsistent. People began to lose faith in officials, seeing that those in power were either compromised or ineffective. The trade itself became almost impossible to stop because the profit was enormous. Smugglers knew that bribing officials was cheaper than risking punishment. For many in the system, participating in corruption wasn't a moral choice, It was a survival strategy. The empire's attempts to control opium often failed because the people responsible for enforcing the law had incentives to let it continue. Even honest officials struggled. Some tried to act against smugglers and addicts, but they often faced resistance from local elites, higher authorities, or even the traders themselves. Punishing a smuggler or seizing shipments could spark political backlash or diplomatic tension with foreign powers. This fear of conflict slowed decisive action and allowed corruption to spread further. Meanwhile, addiction and social problems increased. Families suffered, productivity declined, and cities saw rising social tension. Corruption and opium were feeding each other. The more officials accepted bribes, the easier it was for opium to spread, and the more opium spread, the more bribes flowed into the system. It became a vicious cycle. By this point, corruption had become a structural problem. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a symptom of a system struggling to cope with internal weakness, foreign pressure, and a society in crisis. Smugglers thrived, addicts multiplied, and honest officials were often powerless to stop the decay. This stage of history shows how systems can fail from within when greed, fear, and weakness combine. The Qing Empire was still strong in many ways, but corruption had infiltrated its enforcement system, making it almost impossible to stop the very problem the empire had recognized: the opium trade. In short, corruption inside the system allowed opium to flourish, weakened authority, and set the stage for larger conflicts that would soon shake the empire to its core. The warning signs were clear, but the system itself was now part of the problem. For years, opium quietly infiltrated Chinese society. Addiction spread, families struggled, and corruption had taken root in the system. The empire had ignored warning signs for too long, but by the early 19th century, the crisis could no longer be overlooked. At last, the emperor decided it was time to act. The Qing emperor appointed Lin Zexu, a determined and upright official, to tackle the opium problem. Lin was famous for his integrity and courage, and he understood that small measures were no longer enough. He saw the social, economic, and moral damage caused by opium and vowed to stop it completely. Lin began by targeting smugglers and foreign traders directly. He issued strict orders: all opium in the ports had to be surrendered, and anyone caught smuggling would face severe punishment. To enforce these rules, he gathered loyal officials and local forces, determined to end the trade once and for all. One of Lin's most famous actions was demanding that foreign traders hand over all their opium stocks. This wasn't easy. The British and other Western merchants had grown rich from the trade and were unwilling to give it up. But Lin was persistent. He also issued strong warnings to the population, urging people to quit opium and avoid the habit entirely. To deal with corruption, Lin tried to enforce strict accountability. Officials who took bribes or turned a blind eye were punished. This sent a clear message: the empire was serious about ending opium, and no one would be exempt, no matter their status. Lin's actions had an immediate impact. Large quantities of opium were seized and destroyed, including tons of the drug that were publicly burned in Guangzhou. These dramatic measures shocked the population and sent a clear signal that the emperor was finally taking the problem seriously. But the emperor's response also created tension with foreign powers. Western traders, especially the British, were angry at the loss of their valuable opium and resisted Lin's enforcement. The stage was being set for conflict. China was standing up to foreign influence and defending its society. but the Western powers were not willing to accept limits on their profits. Lin Zexu's response marked a turning point. The Qing Empire was no longer ignoring the problem, it was actively confronting it. His actions showed strong leadership and a willingness to protect society from the damaging effects of opium. However, while Lin's efforts were bold and effective in the short term, the challenge was enormous. Smuggling networks, foreign pressure, and entrenched addiction made it nearly impossible to solve the crisis completely. The emperor had acted, but the fight against opium would be long and difficult. This chapter shows that even powerful empires can hesitate until a problem becomes unavoidable. When China finally responded, it was decisive and courageous, but it also highlighted how years of neglect had made the crisis far more dangerous. The emperor's action was a wake-up call for the empire, for society, and for the foreign traders who thought they could profit without consequence. In the end, the emperor's response demonstrated that leadership and decisive action can challenge even the most entrenched problems, but only if the will to act finally meets the courage to do so. When the Qing Empire, under emperor's orders and Lin Zexu's leadership, started cracking down on the opium trade, it wasn't just a domestic problem anymore. Foreign powers, especially the British, quickly resisted. They had made enormous profits from the opium trade, and they were not willing to give it up. The British East India Company and European merchants saw Lin's strict measures as a threat to their wealth and influence. They argued that opium was just a product and that China had no right to interfere with trade. Smuggling networks were disrupted, shipments were seized, and profits were threatened. This resistance wasn't just about money, it was also about power and prestige. The tension grew quickly. British traders demanded compensation for their losses and protested Lin Zexu's actions through diplomatic channels. They claimed that China was violating international trade norms, even though opium had been illegal in China for decades. The Qing Empire's refusal to back down surprised many Western powers. They realized China was serious about enforcing its laws, and that bold action could challenge Western profits. Smugglers and traders also became more aggressive. Some tried to bribe officials, while others tried to secretly transport opium despite Lin's strict measures. Ships sailed under flags of different nations, hoping to avoid seizure. The trade had grown into a global network, and foreign resistance meant that stopping it completely would be almost impossible without confrontation. The conflict between China and foreign traders foreshadowed a bigger struggle. The opium issue was no longer just a social problem inside China, it had become a point of international tension. The empire's laws and moral stance were clashing with the economic ambitions of powerful Western nations. Lin Zexu's determination was unmatched, but he faced a difficult reality. Foreign powers had more advanced ships, global networks, and financial resources. While he could seize opium in ports and punish local smugglers, he couldn't control trade on the high seas or influence foreign governments directly. This resistance highlighted the imbalance of power in global trade at the time. China, despite being rich and organized, faced a new kind of threat, a combination of foreign profit motives, diplomatic pressure, and smuggling networks that could bypass national laws. The struggle was no longer just about opium, it was about sovereignty, international influence, and the empire's ability to protect its people. By confronting foreign traders, the Qing Empire was taking a bold stand, but the resistance from Western powers made it clear that enforcing the opium ban would not be easy. Profits, power, and greed were stronger than laws or morality in this case, and the empire was entering a dangerous phase of confrontation that would soon escalate beyond local enforcement. In short, resistance from foreign powers showed how economic interests can clash with social responsibility. The empire had acted decisively, but global forces were now pushing back, setting the stage for larger conflicts that would test China's strength and resolve. By the time the Qing Empire confronted the opium trade seriously, tensions with foreign powers, especially Britain, had reached a breaking point. The empire had acted decisively, seizing and destroying opium, punishing smugglers, and trying to protect its society. But the foreign traders and governments weren't willing to back down. What followed would change China forever. The opium conflict was no longer just about a drug. It had become a clash of power, economy, and sovereignty. Western powers saw China's enforcement of its laws as a threat to their profits and influence. Smugglers were disrupted, trade was blocked, and billions of dollars in opium profits were at stake. For China, it was about protecting its people, society, and moral order. This struggle marked the beginning of what is now known as the First Opium War. Britain, frustrated by lost profits and trade restrictions, used its naval and military power to force China into submission. The conflict demonstrated a shocking reality. While China had been wealthy and organized, Western powers had military advantages and global reach that China hadn't fully anticipated. The consequences were immediate and profound. Ports were attacked, cities faced blockades, and the empire's inability to match Western naval technology became painfully clear. The opium conflict revealed weaknesses in China's military and strategic planning, highlighting a gap between traditional power and modern, industrialized warfare. On the social side, the war and opium trade together created chaos. Addiction continued to spread, families were disrupted, and corruption persisted. The empire's attempt to solve the opium crisis collided with foreign resistance, showing that economic and social reforms at home could be undone by international pressure. The treaties that ended the war, such as the Treaty of Nanking, forced China to open ports, pay huge indemnities, and grant foreign powers privileges that eroded its sovereignty. The opium conflict, which began as a domestic social and economic issue, had escalated into an international crisis that reshaped China's position in the world. This chapter shows how a single trade, if left unchecked and mixed with global greed, can escalate into massive political and military consequences. The opium conflict changed everything. It exposed weaknesses, challenged authority, and forced China into a new, uncomfortable relationship with foreign powers. Ultimately, the opium conflict was more than a war over a drug. It was a collision between civilizations, economies, and worldviews. It demonstrated how global trade, addiction, and resistance could converge to create a crisis that reshaped an entire empire. China would never be the same after this. The opium conflict didn't just affect trade or addiction, it transformed politics, society, and the balance of power in ways that would be felt for decades. The Opium War didn't just highlight trade problems or social issues, it exposed one of the Qing Empire's biggest vulnerabilities: military weakness. For centuries, China had been powerful and organized, confident in its ability to protect its borders and maintain order. But confronting industrialized Western powers revealed a very different reality. When Britain sent its modern navy to China, Qing forces were unprepared. Chinese ships were outdated, slow, and poorly armed compared to the British steam, powered warships with cannons that could fire accurately from long distances. Traditional armies and city defenses, which had been effective against regional threats, were almost useless against modern Western military technology. The first battles were devastating. Chinese forts and ports, previously considered secure, were easily overpowered. Soldiers trained in traditional methods struggled to counter new tactics. This wasn't just a question of numbers. Technology and strategy were outdated, and China's military infrastructure couldn't match the efficiency of European forces. The Qing leadership realized that their assumptions about strength were misleading. For centuries, the empire had relied on size, organization, and tradition to project power. But in the face of industrialized warfare, those advantages were not enough. The military weakness became painfully obvious, shaking confidence in the empire's ability to defend itself and its people. This exposure also had social and political consequences. Citizens and officials saw that the empire, despite its wealth and organization, could not protect itself from foreign powers. Morale dropped, corruption worsened, and calls for reform slowly began to emerge. People realized that traditional methods alone could no longer ensure safety, sovereignty, or stability. The conflict showed that military power was not just about manpower or territory. It was about technology, strategy, and adaptability. China's failure to modernize its forces became a lesson with far-reaching consequences, influencing policies and reforms in the decades that followed. By the end of the Opium War, it was clear that the empire's military weakness had been exposed to the world. Ports were lost, cities had been threatened, and foreign powers had demonstrated their ability to dictate terms. This moment marked a turning point. China would need to rethink its defense, technology, and approach to foreign threats, or risk further humiliation. In short, the war revealed that an empire could be rich, organized, and proud, and still be vulnerable if it did not adapt to changing times. Military weakness had been hidden for years, but the Opium conflict brought it into the open, forever altering China's view of itself and the world. The Opium War ended with a harsh lesson for China. Power isn't just about size or wealth, it's also about military strength, diplomacy, and global influence. The Qing Empire, once proud and self-sufficient, faced a new reality. It had been forced into signing unequal treaties that undermined its sovereignty and humiliated the nation. The most famous of these treaties was the Treaty of Nanking, which ended the First Opium War. China had to open several ports to foreign trade, pay huge indemnities, and cede territory, including Hong Kong, to Britain. Western powers gained privileges to trade freely, live in special areas, and enjoy legal protections that the Chinese themselves did not have. These terms were extremely one-sided and clearly favored the foreigners. For the Chinese people, the treaty was more than just a legal document. It was a symbol of humiliation. The empire had been forced to accept conditions that went against centuries of tradition, pride, and independence. Officials and citizens alike felt the sting of powerlessness. Their laws, their economy, and even parts of their territory were now controlled or heavily influenced by foreign powers. The unequal treaties didn't stop with Britain. Soon other Western nations, and even Japan later on, forced China into similar agreements, gaining trade privileges, territory, and legal immunity. Each treaty chipped away at China's authority and independence, turning the once proud empire into a country forced to bend to foreign interests. The social impact was also profound. People began to question the Qing leadership and its ability to protect the nation. Morale dropped, corruption worsened, and a sense of vulnerability spread through society. Humiliation wasn't just political, it was personal, felt in daily life as foreign powers gained influence over trade, ports, and laws. Economically, the treaties created huge strain. Indemnities drained the treasury, foreign merchants flooded markets, and Chinese industries struggled to compete. Trade was no longer under Chinese control, and profits flowed outward rather than benefiting local communities. The nation's wealth and resources were being siphoned off, deepening resentment and frustration. The unequal treaties marked the beginning of a new era in Chinese history, the century of humiliation. For the next decades, China would face repeated foreign pressure, internal rebellions, and struggles to modernize. The Opium Crisis, foreign resistance, and military weakness had combined to create a situation where China's sovereignty was compromised on multiple levels. This chapter shows how a series of conflicts and failures can lead to profound national consequences. What began as a social and trade problem, opium, ultimately escalated into international humiliation and long-lasting challenges. The Qing Empire had survived for centuries, but now it faced an era where foreign influence, internal weakness, and national pride were in direct conflict. In short, the unequal treaties were more than legal agreements. They were a stark reminder of vulnerability, the price of ignoring early warning signs, and the heavy cost of national weakness in a world of expanding global powers. After the Opium Crisis, the wars, and the unequal treaties, China faced a harsh reality: its economy was collapsing. The flow of silver, trade profits, and resources had been heavily disrupted. Opium addiction drained money from families. Indemnities and reparations drained the state treasury, and foreign powers dominated key ports and trade routes. Cities that were once bustling with local trade now faced instability. Merchants struggled to compete with foreign traders, taxes increased to pay war debts, and inflation made daily life harder for ordinary people. The gap between rich and poor widened, and basic necessities became more expensive. Families were forced to make impossible choices between food, shelter, and, tragically, opium. This economic collapse didn't happen in isolation. It fueled social unrest. Peasants, workers, and townspeople began to protest unfair taxes, corruption, and foreign exploitation. Rebellions, some small and local, others larger and organized, broke out across the empire. The government tried to respond, but it was weak, stretched thin, and often mistrusted by the population. Opium addiction played a key role in the unrest. Addicted officials and workers were less effective, weakening governance and public trust. Smuggling networks continued. Corruption persisted, and ordinary people felt the empire couldn't protect them from either foreign exploitation or internal problems. Social tension built like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. The combination of economic hardship and social unrest created a vicious cycle. Poverty and inequality drove people toward rebellion, while rebellion disrupted local economies and trade further. Communities faced violence, insecurity, and declining opportunities for work and survival. The empire's strength was eroding from both economic and social pressures. At the same time, foreign powers continued to benefit from China's struggles. Trade privileges from unequal treaties allowed foreign merchants to dominate key markets, undermining local industries and further straining the economy. The empire had lost control over major aspects of its own commerce, making economic recovery even more difficult. By the mid-19th century, China was trapped in a dangerous loop: foreign exploitation, internal corruption, opium addiction, and economic collapse, all feeding social unrest. Ordinary people bore the brunt of these pressures, leading to widespread discontent that would fuel more rebellions and challenge the authority of the Qing Dynasty. This chapter shows how interconnected crises, economics, social, and political, can destabilize even a long-standing empire. The opium crisis had begun as a trade and addiction problem, but by this stage, it had contributed to economic collapse and widespread social unrest, threatening the very foundations of Chinese society. In short, the combination of economic hardship and social turmoil turned China into a nation struggling to survive. The empire's authority was weakened, the people were frustrated and angry, and the stage was set for decades of internal and external challenges that would reshape the country. By the mid-19th century, the Qing Dynasty was showing serious cracks. Years of opium addiction, foreign pressure, economic collapse, and social unrest had weakened the empire from within. What had once been one of the most powerful and organized empires in the world now struggled to maintain control over its people and territory. The empire faced rebellions on multiple fronts. Peasant uprisings angered by poverty, unfair taxes, and corruption erupted across the countryside. The famous Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest in history, shook the empire to its core, fueled by a mix of social frustration, religious ideas, and opposition to Qing authority. The government found it difficult to respond effectively because its resources were stretched thin and officials were often incompetent or corrupt. Foreign powers also continued to exert pressure. Treaties from earlier conflicts had already reduced the empire's sovereignty, and Western nations were quick to exploit any sign of weakness. China's ports, trade, and even some territories were under foreign influence, further undermining confidence in the dynasty. Inside the government, corruption and inefficiency worsened. Officials often acted in self-interest rather than serving the people. Bribes, favoritism, and incompetence made it harder to respond to crises. When combined with addiction among some officials and military leaders, the result was a system that could no longer enforce laws or maintain order effectively. The social fabric was fraying as well. Families suffered from poverty, addiction, and displacement caused by rebellion or war. Local communities struggled to survive, and resentment toward both the government and foreign powers grew. The dynasty's moral and political authority, the foundation of its rule, was being seriously challenged. By this stage, the Qing dynasty was no longer the strong, unshakable empire of the past. It had become a patchwork of local authorities, weakened central power, and contested territories. The combination of internal rebellion, economic instability, and foreign domination made governance increasingly impossible. The fall of the dynasty was not sudden, it was a slow decline, building over decades of crisis. Yet the signs were unmistakable: weakened military, corrupt officials, widespread addiction, economic collapse, social unrest, and the inability to respond to foreign pressures. These factors together signaled that the Qing dynasty's days as a dominant power were numbered. In short, the dynasty began to fall apart not because of a single event, but because a series of internal and external pressures combined over time. The empire had survived centuries of challenges, but the opium crisis, foreign exploitation, and internal decay finally created a situation where its foundations could no longer hold. After centuries of power, wealth, and influence, the Qing dynasty, the last great imperial dynasty of China, was finally reaching its end. Decades of internal weakness, social unrest, economic collapse, corruption, and foreign pressure had left the empire fragile and vulnerable. The once proud empire that had ruled vast lands with stability was now struggling to survive. The opium crisis, which had quietly begun as a trade issue, had played a huge role in this decline. Addiction spread through society, draining families and weakening officials. Smuggling and foreign resistance exposed the empire's inability to control trade. Corruption made enforcement ineffective, while economic collapse and social unrest destabilized communities. The combined effect of these factors slowly ate away at the foundations of the dynasty. Rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion and local uprisings further weakened central control. Millions suffered and died, and the government's authority was challenged like never before. Even when the dynasty tried to respond, it lacked the resources, military strength, and social trust needed to regain control. Foreign powers continued to exploit China's weakness. Unequal treaties, territorial concessions, and extraterritorial rights meant that the empire could no longer fully govern its own land or protect its people. Ports, trade, and even parts of cities were under foreign influence, making it clear that China was no longer in complete control of its destiny. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Qing Dynasty had become a shadow of its former self. Attempts at reform came too late, and the structural problems, military weakness, corruption, addiction, and foreign domination had taken root too deeply. The empire's collapse was inevitable. The end came gradually, not with a single dramatic event. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution finally overthrew the Qing Dynasty, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. The dynasty's fall marked the conclusion of an era, the end of feudal emperors, dynastic authority, and centuries of centralized imperial power. The story of China's greatest empire teaches an important lesson. Even the mightiest powers can fall when internal weakness, corruption, social problems, and foreign pressures combine. The Qing dynasty's decline was a long process, accelerated by human greed, addiction, and resistance to change. But it also shows how empires rise and fall as a result of both internal choices and external forces. In the end, China's greatest empire ended, but its history, culture, and achievements left a legacy that continues to shape the nation today. The fall of the Qing dynasty was not just the end of a ruling family. It was the end of a world that had once believed China was invincible. Looking back at the fall of China's greatest empire, it's easy to see how a slow, quiet problem can turn into a national crisis. The opium trade started almost unnoticed, but over decades, it triggered addiction, corruption, economic collapse, social unrest, and eventually the fall of the Qing dynasty. This is why we can call it a sleeping tragedy. It grew silently until it was too big to ignore. The first lesson is never ignore warning signs. The empire had reports of addiction, smuggling, and corruption long before the crisis exploded. Officials and rulers hesitated, hoping the problem would fix itself, but ignoring it allowed the issue to grow beyond control. Second, internal weakness is as dangerous as external threats. Opium alone didn't destroy the empire. It was corruption, ineffective governance, and slow response that amplified its effects. A strong, transparent system could have mitigated the damage, but when the system itself is weak, even small problems can become catastrophic. Third, global forces can change local realities. Foreign traders, technology, and international politics didn't just create economic problems, they reshaped China's society and sovereignty. The empire underestimated the influence of outside powers, which made the eventual conflict and humiliation inevitable. Fourth, addiction, and social decay can destabilize entire nations. What might seem like a personal or social issue can quickly escalate into a political and economic crisis if widespread. The opium trade shows how deeply interconnected society, economy, and governance really are. Finally, the story reminds us that change is necessary for survival. China's military, economy, and political structures had remained traditional and proud for centuries. But when the world changed around them, the empire's unwillingness or inability to adapt left it vulnerable. Adaptation is not just survival, it's prevention of disaster. The tragedy of the Qing Dynasty wasn't sudden. It was slow, quiet, and growing, but the lessons remain clear: vigilance, internal strength, adaptability, and awareness of global forces are crucial for any society. Empires, governments, and even individuals can avoid their own sleeping tragedies by paying attention before small problems become unstoppable. In the end, the fall of China's greatest empire teaches us to observe carefully, act decisively, and never underestimate how small issues, left unchecked, can transform into historic consequences. It's a story of patience, pride, power, and ultimately, the price of inaction.